If you walk through the ruins of Aleppo today, you will see the skeletons of a civilization that was murdered in slow motion. You will see apartment blocks with their facades torn off, exposing the intimate interiors of homes where families once gathered for dinner. You will see the ancient souks, once the commercial arteries of the Silk Road, reduced to rubble and ash. You will see the faces of the displaced, the traumatized, the forgotten, wandering through streets that no longer lead anywhere. The world was told a story about Syria. It was a story about democracy and dictatorship, about Arab Spring and brutal repression, about sectarian hatreds that boiled over into civil war. That story was not entirely false, but it was catastrophically incomplete. Beneath the surface of this humanitarian catastrophe, hidden from the cameras and the diplomatic communiques, ran a different kind of war. A war fought not for freedom or ideology, but for something far more valuable. A war fought for natural gas. A war fought for the right to build a pipeline. 2 pipelines, to be precise. 2 competing visions for how the vast gas reserves of the Middle East would reach the hungry markets of Europe. One pipeline backed by Qatar and the Western powers, another backed by Iran and its allies. Both pipelines needed to cross Syrian territory. Only one could survive. In 2009, Bashar al-Assad made a decision that would seal the fate of his country. Said no to one pipeline and yes to another. He chose Iran over Qatar. He chose Russia over America. Within 2 years, his nation would be engulfed in flames. This is the story of the pipeline war nobody talks about. It is the story of how the world's great powers reduced an ancient civilization to rubble over a piece of infrastructure that was never built. It is the story of how hundreds of thousands died and millions fled so that energy companies could chase profits measured in billions. It is a story about money dressed up as morality. It is a warning about what happens when great powers play chess on a board made of other people's homes. To understand the pipeline war, we must first understand the geography of energy. We must understand why the Middle East became the most strategically valuable real estate on Earth. In 1971, the world experienced a seismic shift in global power. The South Pars gas field was discovered beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf. It was not merely large. It was the largest natural gas reserve ever found. 24 trillion cubic meters of natural gas lay trapped beneath the seabed, enough to power European cities for a century. But here was the complication that would shape the next 50 years of Middle Eastern politics. The South Pars field did not belong to one nation. It straddled the maritime border between Iran and Qatar. The Iranians called their portion South Pars. The Qataris called theirs the North Field. It was a single geological formation, divided by an arbitrary line drawn by colonial cartographers who had no idea what lay beneath the waves. By the early 2000s, both nations were extracting gas at furious rates. Both nations were looking for buyers, and the biggest buyer in the world was Europe. The European Union consumed more natural gas than any other bloc on Earth. Its aging coal plants were being shut down. Its nuclear programs were stalled. Its economies were growing. It needed gas, and it needed it delivered reliably, cheaply, and in enormous quantities. There was only one problem. Between the gas fields of the Persian Gulf and the consumers of Europe lay 1,000 miles of some of the most unstable territory on the planet. Iraq, Syria, Turkey, or alternatively, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. Any pipeline would have to cross multiple borders, navigate sectarian tensions, and survive the political earthquakes that regularly convulse the region. Enter Syria. On the map, Syria was a modest nation of 20 million people, but geographically it was the cork in the bottle. Any pipeline from the Gulf to the Mediterranean had to cross Syrian territory. There was no alternative route. The mountains of eastern Turkey were too high. The deserts of Jordan led nowhere. Iraq was a war zone. Syria was the only viable transit corridor. This made Bashar al-Assad one of the most important men in the global energy market, though few outside the industry understood it at the time. He controlled the gateway. Whoever won his favor would build their pipeline. Whoever lost would watch their project die. The Assad regime had ruled Syria since 1970. Hafez al-Assad, the father, had built a police state of remarkable brutality and cunning. He had aligned Syria with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, with Iran during the Iraq-Iran War, and had survived the collapse of his superpower patron through a combination of repression and strategic flexibility. When Bashar inherited the presidency in 2000, he inherited not just a country, but a web of alliances that would determine the course of the pipeline war. Syria was bound to Iran by decades of mutual support. Iran had backed Syria during the Lebanon War. Syria had backed Iran during its isolation. The two regimes, one Shia and one nominally Alawite, were united by their shared enemies, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. They called it the axis of resistance. Their critics called it a marriage of convenience. Qatar, on the other hand, was an American client state hosting the largest U.S. military base in the Middle East. Al Udeid Air Base, just outside Doha, was the command center for all U.S. operations in the region. Qatar had money, ambition, and powerful friends in Washington. What Qatar did not have was a direct route to Europe. The stage was set. Two gas giants, two pipeline proposals, one narrow corridor of Syrian territory, and a dictator who would have to choose. The first proposal arrived in Damascus in 2009. It was backed by Qatar and carried the blessing of the United States, France, and Turkey. The plan was elegant on paper. A $10 billion pipeline running from the North Field in Qatar, northward through Saudi Arabia, into Jordan, across Syria, and terminating at the Turkish port of Ceyhan. From there, the gas would flow under the Mediterranean to Greece and into the European distribution network. The Qatar-Turkey pipeline, as it came to be known, would have transformed the energy map of Eurasia. It would have given Europe an alternative to Russian gas. It would have enriched Qatar beyond imagination. It would have strengthened Turkey's position as an energy hub, and it would have cut Iran out of the European market entirely. The Qataris came to Damascus with promises. They promised transit fees that would generate billions for the Syrian treasury. They promised investment in Syrian infrastructure. They promised a new era of prosperity for a nation still struggling with drought and economic stagnation. But Assad said no. The refusal shocked the Qatari negotiators. They had assumed that money would talk. They had assumed that Assad, facing mounting internal pressures, would jump at the chance for a financial lifeline. They did not understand the web of alliances that constrained his decision. Assad gave his reasons publicly. He said he would not participate in a project designed to harm his ally Russia. Russian gas exports to Europe were worth over $100 billion a year. A Qatari pipeline would have devastated Gazprom's market share. Putin had made clear that any Syrian cooperation with the Qatar project would be viewed as a hostile act. But there was a deeper calculation. Assad understood that the Qatar pipeline was not just about gas. It was about geopolitics. The pipeline would have strengthened the Sunni axis, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey. It would have weakened the Shia axis, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. It would have tilted the regional balance of power against the very allies who guaranteed Assad's survival. In 2010, Assad made his counter-move. He signed a memorandum of understanding for an entirely different pipeline. This one would run from Iran's South Pars field, westward through Iraq, into Syria, and terminate at the Mediterranean port of Latakia. It was called the Islamic Pipeline, though Western analysts preferred the more clinical term Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline. The Islamic Pipeline was everything the Qatar project was not. It would have enriched Iran, not Qatar. It would have bypassed Turkey entirely. It would have given Russia a stake in Middle Eastern gas distribution rather than a competitor. And it would have cemented Syria's position in the axis of resistance for decades to come. The signing ceremony in Damascus was attended by officials from Iran, Iraq, and Syria. They spoke of regional cooperation and shared destiny. They did not speak of the fury their agreement would unleash in Doha and Washington. Qatar had invested years of diplomatic capital in the Turkey pipeline. Saudi Arabia had seen it as a tool to weaken Iranian influence. Turkey had dreamed of becoming the energy crossroads of Eurasia. The American foreign policy establishment had viewed it as the key to reducing European dependence on Russian gas. Assad had said no to all of them. Within months, the Arab Spring erupted. In Tunisia, a fruit vendor set himself on fire and ignited a revolution. In Egypt, millions poured into Tahrir Square. In Libya, the opposition rose against Gaddafi, and in Syria, protests began in the southern city of Daraa. The conventional narrative of the Syrian uprising focuses on domestic grievances, the drought that had displaced farmers, the corruption of the regime, the brutality of the security services. All of these factors were real. Protests that began in March 2011 were genuine expressions of popular anger. But what happened next was not organic. What happened next was the weaponization of a legitimate uprising by foreign powers who had their own reasons to see Assad fall. By the summer of 2011, Qatar had begun funneling weapons and money to rebel groups in Syria. Saudi Arabia followed. Turkey opened its border to fighters and supplies. The United States provided intelligence and eventually arms. Stated goal was democracy. The unstated goal was regime change. The pattern was familiar. It was the same playbook that had been used in Libya, where NATO air power had destroyed Gaddafi's forces while Gulf money armed the rebels. The Libyan intervention had succeeded in toppling a regime. It had also created a failed state that would export chaos across the Mediterranean for a decade. In Syria, the stakes were higher. Assad had a real army. He had Russian backing. He had Iranian ground support. He was not going to fall easily. The rebels fragmented almost immediately. The Free Syrian Army, backed by the West, competed with Islamist factions backed by the Gulf states. Al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, emerged as one of the most effective fighting forces, and lurking in the shadows was the group that would eventually call itself the Islamic State. By 2012, the Syrian civil war had become a proxy battlefield for the great powers. On one side, the United States, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, France, Britain, the same coalition that had backed the Qatar pipeline. On the other side, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, the same coalition that had backed the Islamic pipeline. The maps of the battlefield and the maps of the proposed pipelines overlapped with eerie precision. The fighting was most intense along the corridor where any pipeline would have to run. The ancient cities of Homs and Aleppo, which sat directly on the transit route, were subjected to the most devastating sieges. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the billions of dollars that poured into the conflict from Qatar and Saudi Arabia suggested otherwise. The intelligence agencies of a dozen nations were operating on Syrian soil, each pursuing their own agenda. And beneath all the rhetoric about human rights and democracy, the fundamental question remained: who would control the energy corridor to Europe? The crisis point arrived in August 2013. By then, the death toll had passed 100,000. Millions had fled their homes. The ancient souks of Aleppo had been reduced to rubble, and the Assad regime was losing ground. On August 21st, the world woke to footage of children convulsing in the streets of Ghouta, a suburb of Damascus. Chemical weapons had been deployed. Hundreds were dead, including entire families who had died in their sleep as sarin gas seeped through their windows. President Obama had drawn a red line. The use of chemical weapons, he had declared, would trigger American military intervention. The carriers were positioned in the Mediterranean. The Tomahawk missiles were programmed. The world held its breath, but something strange happened. The bombing campaign never came. At the last moment, Obama pulled back. He announced that he would seek congressional authorization. He opened negotiations with Russia for a chemical weapons deal. The strikes were canceled. The official explanation was diplomacy. The real explanation was more complex. The American military had war-gamed the intervention and found no good options. Assad was not Gaddafi. The Syrian air defenses were Russian-built and formidable. The rebel forces were fragmented and increasingly dominated by jihadists. There was no moderate opposition capable of governing a post-Assad Syria, but there was another factor that the history books tend to omit. In the weeks before the Ghouta attack, the Islamic pipeline had taken a significant step forward. Iraq had announced new agreements to connect its gas infrastructure with Syria. Iran had secured financing for its segment. The project that Western strategists had dismissed as a fantasy was becoming real. American intervention would not just topple Assad. It would create a power vacuum that Iran could fill. The Islamic pipeline might still be built, but now by an Iranian-backed successor regime rather than an American-backed one. The intervention might achieve regime change while losing the pipeline war. Meanwhile, Russia had made its position unmistakably clear. Putin had watched the NATO intervention in Libya with cold fury. He had seen how a UN resolution authorizing a no-fly zone had been twisted into a license for regime change. He had seen Gaddafi murdered in the street by a mob. He was not going to let the same thing happen to Assad. Russian naval vessels moved into position off the Syrian coast. Russian diplomats blocked every attempt at a UN resolution, and Russian intelligence services began providing Assad with satellite imagery and targeting data that turned the tide of the ground war. The moment of maximum American leverage had passed. The window for easy intervention had closed. What remained was a grinding war of attrition that would consume another 5 years and another 300,000 lives. By 2015, the Assad regime was on the verge of collapse. The rebels controlled large swaths of the country. The Islamic State had carved out a caliphate spanning eastern Syria and western Iraq. Damascus itself was within artillery range of opposition forces. In September 2015, Russia intervened directly. Russian jets began bombing rebel positions. Russian special forces deployed alongside Syrian troops. Russian air defenses turned Syrian airspace into a no-go zone for Western aircraft. The intervention was devastating and effective. Within 2 years, the major urban centers had been recaptured. The opposition was pushed back to isolated pockets. The Islamic State was destroyed as a territorial entity. Assad had survived. The pipeline war had reached its bloody conclusion. Qatar's pipeline would never be built. The Iran-Iraq-Syria project remained on the drawing board, frozen by sanctions and the devastation of the transit corridor it was meant to cross. 500,000 people were dead, 12 million were displaced, an ancient civilization had been reduced to rubble. And for what? For a pipeline that was never built, for gas that was never delivered, for profits that were never realized. The true victors of the Syrian pipeline war were not in Damascus or Tehran. They were in Moscow. Russia had achieved something remarkable. By investing a fraction of what Western powers had spent arming the rebellion, Russia had accomplished multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. It had preserved its ally Assad. It had demonstrated that Russian military power could be projected far beyond its borders. It had proven that Moscow would not abandon its clients the way Washington abandoned Mubarak or NATO abandoned Gaddafi. But most importantly, Russia had killed both pipelines. Neither the Qatar project nor the Iran project would be built across a country that had been reduced to rubble. The infrastructure was destroyed. The population was dispersed. The transit corridor that had made Syria strategically valuable was now a wasteland. This meant that Europe remained dependent on Russian gas. Gazprom's market share was secure. The hundreds of billions of dollars that flowed from European consumers to Russian coffers would continue to flow. The pipeline war had been fought to determine who would supply Europe. Russia had won by ensuring that no one new would supply Europe. Consider the mathematics of this victory. Russia spent an estimated $4 billion on its Syrian intervention between 2015 and 2020. In that same period, Russian gas exports to Europe generated over $500 billion in revenue. The return on investment was astronomical. The Syrian people paid the price. By 2020, the country's GDP had collapsed by more than 60%. Half the housing stock was damaged or destroyed. Life expectancy had dropped by 20 years. An entire generation of children had grown up knowing nothing but war, displacement, and trauma. The humanitarian organizations called it the worst refugee crisis since World War II. 12 million Syrians were displaced, half of them fleeing abroad to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and eventually to Europe. The refugee wave that crashed against European borders in 2015 and 2016 reshaped the politics of the continent. It fueled the rise of nationalist movements. It strained the European Union to its breaking point. It changed the outcome of elections from Hungary to Britain. None of this was accidental. The destruction of Syria was not a natural disaster. It was a strategic outcome pursued by multiple actors for multiple reasons. The human cost was not a bug. It was a feature. Meanwhile, the great powers pivoted to the next battleground. The attention of the energy strategists shifted from pipelines to liquefied natural gas. LNG tankers could bypass unstable transit countries entirely. The United States, newly awash in shale gas, began exporting to Europe. Qatar built the world's largest LNG terminal. The pipeline wars gave way to the shipping wars, but the lesson of Syria lingered. It lingered in the ruins of Homs and Aleppo. It lingered in the refugee camps of Turkey and Lebanon. It lingered in the cold calculation that great powers had made, that the lives of hundreds of thousands of people were an acceptable price for energy market share. The Assad regime survived, but it ruled over a devastated nation. Iran had preserved its ally, but at the cost of billions of dollars and thousands of Hezbollah fighters. The Western-backed opposition had been destroyed, but so had any prospect of a democratic Syria. The only infrastructure project that moved forward after the war was not a gas pipeline. It was the reconstruction of Syria's ports and railways by Chinese companies, financed by Chinese loans, designed to connect Syria to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The pipeline war had been fought for Western and Russian energy interests. The reconstruction would be financed by Beijing. In the end, the great powers had fought to a stalemate over a prize that no longer existed. The transit corridor had been destroyed. The populations that would have maintained the pipelines had fled. The institutions that would have regulated the flow of gas had collapsed. Syria had been reduced from a strategic asset to a strategic liability. History does not often provide such clear lessons, but the Syrian pipeline war offers one that cannot be ignored. When great powers fight proxy wars over resources, the proxy pays the price. The resources remain in the ground. The infrastructure is never built. The only thing that flows is blood. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within months, the energy architecture of Europe was transformed. The Nord Stream pipelines that carried Russian gas to Germany were sabotaged in a still unexplained act of industrial terrorism. European nations scrambled to find alternative supplies. LNG tankers from America and Qatar crossed the Atlantic in unprecedented numbers. The war that had been fought in Syria from 2011 to 2020 had been a prelude. It had been a test run for a larger conflict over energy supplies, transit routes, and great power competition. The same dynamics were now playing out on European soil, but Syria had taught a lesson that some observers had failed to learn. Pipelines are not just infrastructure. They are instruments of geopolitical power. Control the pipeline, and you control the nations that depend on it. Destroy the pipeline, and you reshape the energy map of continents. The competition for energy routes has not ended. It has simply moved. New pipeline projects are being proposed through Central Asia, through the Caucasus, through the Eastern Mediterranean. Each project carries the same risks that the Syrian pipelines carried. Each project could become the flashpoint for the next proxy war. The story of Syria is the story of what happens when energy strategy overrides human cost. The planners in Doha and Washington and Moscow saw pipelines and transit corridors. They saw market share and geopolitical leverage. They did not see the families in Aleppo, the farmers in Dara, the children who would grow up in refugee camps. When the history books are written about the early 21st century, Syria will not be remembered as a civil war. It will be remembered as the first great resource war of the new era. It will be remembered as the moment when the world's powers demonstrated that they were willing to destroy nations to control energy flows. The pipelines were never built. The gas was never delivered. The transit fees were never collected. But the bill was paid in full by the Syrian people. Remember that calculation when you hear about the next strategic pipeline. Remember that beneath the maps and the projections and the financial models, there are always people who will pay the price when the great powers start to play. Remember that the most expensive pipeline in history was the one that was never built. The ruins of Aleppo stand today as a monument to the hidden logic of energy warfare. The ancient stones that once echoed with the commerce of the Silk Road are silent now. Caravans that once carried spices and silks have been replaced by aid convoys carrying flour and medicine. The city that survived Mongol invasions and Ottoman sieges and French occupation was finally destroyed by a war over a pipeline that was never built. The gas still sits beneath the Persian Gulf waiting. The markets still hunger for energy. The great powers still maneuver for advantage. Nothing has been learned. Everything has been paid. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.